Hi everybody, and welcome to our module on the pharyngeal pouches and clefts. The pharyngeal apparatus is this collection of bumps that you can see in the embryo, and it contains three components: the pharyngeal arches, pharyngeal clefts, and pharyngeal pouches. In another video I discussed the pharyngeal arches, and in this video we'll focus on the clefts and the pouches. If you were to take a 4-week embryo, as is shown on the screen here, and look down in this direction on it, you would see something like what is on the right side of the screen. Each of these circular bumps is one of the pharyngeal arches. They are a pair. There's one on the left and one on the right. Outside of the arches, there are these little indentations between each arch. Those are called the pharyngeal clefts. They're on the outside of the embryo. And then on the inside of the embryo, there are these grooves running down the middle between the arches, and those are called the pharyngeal pouches. And here's another picture just to make this more clear. If you took a 4-week embryo, like what's shown at the bottom left side of the screen, and you cut it along that black line and then look down upon it, you would see something like what's at the top left. The circles are the pharyngeal arches, the indentations on the outside are the clefts, and the grooves running down the middle are the pharyngeal pouches. Also note that this drawing shows that the pharyngeal pouches, which are towards the inside, are made of endoderm. That should make sense to you since endoderm usually gives rise to internal structures like the GI tract. The outside, which makes up the pharyngeal clefts, comes from ectoderm, and that also should make sense because exterior structures like the skin often come from the ectoderm. The arches in the middle come from mesenchyme, which is mostly mesoderm. So we'll start by talking about the pharyngeal pouches, which are those grooves that run through the middle of the embryo. There are 4 pharyngeal pouches in humans, and as I said before, they are composed of endoderm. The first pharyngeal pouch forms many portions of the inner ear, especially the eustachian tube. If you look at this drawing of ear structures at the bottom right side of the screen here, this is the eustachian tube. This structure is shown in red here. In addition, the first pharyngeal pouch develops into the middle ear cavity, and it contributes some components to the tympanic membrane. The second pharyngeal pouch gives rise to the palatine tonsils in the back of the throat. If you look at this drawing I've placed on the screen here, these are the palatine tonsils on either side at the back of the throat. The way these tonsils develop is that the second pouch forms buds, which will eventually become the lining of the tonsils. The buds are invaded by mesoderm and later invaded by lymphatic tissue to become the structures in the adult. The third pharyngeal pouch develops into the thymus, which is a mediastinal structure. It also develops into the left and right inferior parathyroid glands in the neck. If you look at this drawing on the screen here, the red structure is the thyroid gland. Sitting on top of that are these 4 green dots, which represent the parathyroid glands, and the 2 inferior parathyroid glands derive from the third pharyngeal pouch. This pouch forms 2 wings. One is called the dorsal wing towards the back. That forms the parathyroid glands. The other one is called the ventral wing towards the front. That forms the thymus gland. The fourth pharyngeal pouch forms the other 2 parathyroid glands, the superior parathyroid glands. Those are the 2 glands I'm circling with my pen in this drawing on the screen here. In addition to the parathyroid glands, the other important structure that derives from the fourth pharyngeal pouch is called the ultimobronchial body. This structure gets its name because it is the last structure derived from the bronchial arches, hence the ultimobronchial body. And what this structure does is incorporate into the thyroid gland and form the C cells of the thyroid gland, which are the cells that secrete calcitonin. They're also called parafollicular cells. Now, for years, it has been taught that the C cells are derived from neural crest cells. This is what I learned in medical school, and this is what many sources still say. There's one recent paper that came out about 2017 that has evidence that the C cells may actually derive from the endoderm. Recall that your endoderm is what gives rise to your GI tract and your lungs. The ectoderm is what gives rise to the neural crest cells. Not everyone is in agreement about this, but I point this out because different sources will say different things. I've written it on the screen here as it is classically taught that the C cells come from neural crest cells. Some sources will say they come from the endoderm. And then just like the third pharyngeal pouch, the fourth pouch also forms 2 wings. The dorsal or back wing forms the parathyroid glands, and the ventral or front wing forms the ultimobronchial body. The most important clinical correlation of the pharyngeal pouches that you should definitely know for the Step 1 exam is DeGeorge syndrome, which is also called thymic aplasia. This is an immunodeficiency syndrome, which I discuss in detail in the immunology video on immunodeficiency, but I'll briefly review it here. In this syndrome, there is failure of the third and fourth pharyngeal pouches to form. Most cases are caused by a deletion on chromosome 22 at the Q11 position. This results in an abnormal thymus and parathyroid function because, as we just discussed, the thymus and the parathyroids both derive from the third and fourth pharyngeal pouches. So the classic triad in a child born with DiGeorge syndrome is to have loss of the thymus and therefore loss of T cells and recurrent infections, also loss of the parathyroid glands and therefore hypocalcemia and tetany, and then finally these children often have congenital heart defects called conotruncal defects. These are defects up at the top of the heart, often defects that involve the aorta and pulmonary arteries, and that's because those structures are close to the structures that derive from the third and fourth pharyngeal pouch. Now let's talk about the pharyngeal clefts. There are 4 pharyngeal clefts, just like there are 4 pouches, but the clefts form on the exterior of the embryo, and therefore they are lined by ectoderm, not endoderm like the pouches. The first pharyngeal cleft develops into the external auditory meatus. The word meatus just means passage, and many people call this the external auditory canal. It's shown in green in the drawing here. In addition, the first cleft contributes somewhat to the tympanic membrane. And the pharyngeal clefts are fairly easy to remember in terms of what structures they form in the adult, because the second through fourth clefts really don't form anything important. They develop into a structure called the cervical sinus, which is a temporary cavity in the embryo that obliterates during normal development. Sometimes one of the pharyngeal clefts will persist after birth, and this will develop into a structure called a branchial cleft cyst. This usually presents as a neck mass. The exact location in the neck depends on which pharyngeal cleft was the origin of the cyst. Second cleft cysts are the most common. This is what you should know for step 1 of your boards. They usually present below the angle of the mandible, just in front of the sternocleidomastoid muscle where I'm circling with my pen. They're often noticed when they become infected and therefore become painful, and sometimes a fistula can develop to the skin and this can ooze pus. These often occur in children, and in a board question this will usually be a child with a neck mass. And a very important finding on physical exam is that the mass does not move with swallowing. Contrast this with another neck mass that occurs in children called a thyroglossal duct cyst, which I talk about in the video on the thyroid gland in the endocrine section. That is usually a midline mass, not a mass below the angle of the jaw, and it moves with swallowing. And that concludes our video on the pharyngeal pouches and clefts.